the basic, the agenda that I have here is touch upon security foundations, and this goes across multiple pillars, and then get into the meat of the topic, authentication and authorization. And as we go along, we'll touch upon other additional security best practices areas. My preference to take question is basically interrupt me anytime. I tend to go fast and get into the actual mode of delivering. So anytime you have questions, feel free to interrupt. And I want it to be more valuable for you and not just necessarily complete my slide deck, right? So that's how, because I learned from those questions too. Okay, it's important, very important. Job zero. There is off and in, like what hypervisor down to the power cooling is us, but anything you bring into the cloud is your, but we give you tools, right? Encryption, decryption, identity, and other set of things. These are the top 6 key security areas, right? And we will be going more deeper into authentication today. Others will be touching at kind of a high level. First, security foundation starts with actual account VPC design, right? I've been working with last 4 years. Initially, I've seen customers with one account and they have hit limits. Like VPC has a security group and they've had 1,000 EC2 instances within one VPC. And from there, we have had good amount of learning. So now there is the best practices that you got to have management account. You can have AWS organizations, and you can have control tower, which can pretty much do guardrail for your entire AWS infra. Single sign-on from a multiple, and we'll be touching upon single sign-on very soon. Have a log archival account. For key logs, securely, safely, you move CloudTrail config so that you can do forensics whenever you have the need. It just has read-only access across different accounts that you will have for your organization. The third is kind of having a security operations account. So you install your security-based tool, and it has access to other accounts, so they can do other security-related operations. And then finally is your actual workloads. And some customers go by business units. Some customers go by LOBs, line of business application. And some I have seen done account by different SDLC lifecycle. Usually dev and prod segregation is a good idea. I've seen customers go beyond that, DUT, DIT, SIT also. So that's on the first security foundation, multiple account VPC design. Great idea to have different set of accounts, security blast radius, have security operations account, and single sign-on. Again, depending on your enterprise organization and directory, you may be or you may not be able to, but we'll discuss the options later. The second is threat modeling, right? Identify and prioritize your risks. And typically, if you have an application, what I like to do is what are the endpoints? Based on that, I can just quickly do a threat model analysis. And from there, you can reverse engineer. Do I have to do pen testing? Do I have to do DDoS based? So you could come back with list of test cases that you have to add. Okay, so those two, and then we come into identity, right? Very basic. Authentication is who. Authorization is what privileges do you have, right? Are you who you are? Are you saying that? And what permissions do you have? Like what can you do? And once you go towards cloud, there is one distinction that happens. It's not just authentication and authorization for the user. It's also about the resources that you are accessing in the cloud. Okay, before and after. Like if you take security before the cloud, pretty much network perimeter-based security, right? So you implemented security primarily in that network perimeter. Now the keyword is defense in depth. So each layer of your application, you would be implementing security. So network exists with security group, NACLs, but you actually end up implementing IAM-based or your own maybe federation-based security at each of your layers. So if you have a classic 3-tier application like web tier, API tier, data tier, so you will implement security at each tier also. So you have a defense in depth in your security. And if I want to map the legacy model of teaming, right? This is a classic enterprise legacy model of teaming where you have management, infosec team, infrastructure, network security developers. On the right is the security areas. So if you have security risk, usually it's the management. Policy controls is infosec. I know I have had good amount of fights in my own. I mean, we probably need to work together better in the cloud. Network security infrastructure, SDLC has many tenets to it. SDLC as in the actual code development, so code security standards, SDLC as in DevOps, so CI/CD pipeline, and DevSecOps, the new term that's being coined, it goes across different set of pillars. right? So essentially security doesn't become just afterthought. It's basically SDLC lifecycle. And you're not looking to just enable security at the end. Like many times I have seen application team go to AppSec review at the end, like, can you just approve this for us, right? So you don't want that kind of thing.
Oh, we do have a question, which is,
Yes.
can you promote an AWS account to be the main account in an organization?
To be the main account, I don't understand the main account. We will touch upon root user and IAM users. There is permissioning, like the policies that you assign to an account, and that can evolve to be having an admin-based policies. That way you can give them higher privileges.
So that's not the question. The question was that we started with one account, as so many people did, and then we got involved with the organizations. So now that account that you had in the upper left-hand corner is also our main development account. So that doesn't really match, right? Can I take a new account that would just be the management stuff and promote it to be, I think you guys call it master account or main account?
Yep.
Does that?
Assume role might help with that as well, right?
So assume role, maybe we're jumping there. So let's keep that question as a parking thought. I'll come to that question. Okay. So as part of your identity journey, you got to understand different set of use cases, right? The first is if you see an enterprise corporate employee use case and an end consumer application access use case. An employee joins, maybe does some work in one team, maybe changes his role, maybe leaves the organization. Each one of them is basically there is a identity and permissions event, right? When he joins, creation of identity, he gets assigned to a project. There is a privilege change. He changes his role. Again, privilege change. He leaves the organization. That identity is inactive. And if you take the consumer flow for an application, whenever a new user comes in, he will sign up, right? He'll get his access. There is sign in, registration, sign out kind of a flow. That's the corporate employee flow. If you see from a user's point of view who's accessing AWS, there are two: operator, machine, and there's obviously end client for the application. Operator as in, let's say, DevOps users, person who are actually working to deploy your applications, right? Folks who work on Terraform, CloudFormation, CDK, templating, and they deploy it onto your AWS environment. They need to have access. That's human-based operator access. You may have machines take and do some operations. So in terms of cloud environment, it's a compute environment. So it could be EC2 for virtual machine, containers, ECS, EKS, and serverless, Lambda or serverless, right? Each one can actually assume, again, permissions, and we'll touch upon the assume role, what it means, and then do some operation on your behalf, right? So this is a user's point of view. Operator access, usually this one is a SAML-based flow in enterprise organization. Machine is usually a assume role. So you assign a role to a compute service, and that compute service runs under that assumed role. And then the third is end client flow. That could be OAuth-based, maybe Cognito or some other providers. The third is data and permissioning. So essentially, when you bring in good amount of data onto AWS, you may think of like, maybe I want to create a data lake. Maybe I want to move that data from one data service to other, Redshift, RDS, EMR. So do you want data to move along with that? The permissions should also move, right? How are you doing permissioning for that? Sometimes customers may ask, like, I want to have a fine-grained level permissioning. So at the table level, maybe at the row level, and they may have their own custom ask for it. How do you do that? Similarly, another use case is DevSecOps, commit, promotion, code review, approval flow. Each one has teams who are all working for that particular project. Again, there is permissioning that comes in there. Custom applications, when you deploy, the custom applications may have its own identity and authorization use cases. How do you enable that? And the last but not the least, for each of these use cases, you may have some or the other additional information about the user that needs to be passed in. If it is federation-based use cases, you are getting some additional attributes from the actual identity store, right? So those additional attributes can be used to do authorizations. So these are common set of identity use cases that you will come across when you're working on different workloads on the cloud. Now come to the basics of IAM. There are three constructs: IAM user, IAM group, and IAM role. Users are permanent credentials. They have access key, secret access key, and usually people start with creating a user to manipulate AWS services, and then eventually graduate into maybe integrating with some kind of corporate directory, SAML-based provider, and then you actually move away from using permanent credentials. You go to grouping is just a management convenience, just to manage set of users together. And role is the one which is the most important in IAM ecosystem. Role does not have long-term credentials. It essentially inherently talks to STS, gets the temp credentials. So anybody, when he says, I'm assuming a role, essentially make it down that assuming a role means there's a STS call and there's a temporary credentials being created. And that's the credential under which the operations will work. Okay, so here's the flow. IAM user calls STS and it gets the temp credentials. In AWS console, just to quickly show for the folks who are very new here, let's get in. Let me go in here. Okay, I'm gonna quickly just create a new user for the sake of demo here. Meetup user 2021. I'm gonna give this user programmatic access.
Hey,
AJ?
Amit, you're showing the PowerPoint right now.
Oh, I am on the. Let me reshare. Okay, can you see my screen now?
You're not
No.
sharing anything right now. Here we go.
That's good.
Okay, so I'm creating a new user. Okay. So this is the new user that got created. It has access key and secret access key. What can I do with it? Let's take an example inside Visual Studio. Here I have a AWS toolkit installed. Once you install the toolkit, what you see something called AWS Explorer. And here I can put that credentials and connect to my AWS environment. In this case, I have already done that. So if you see, I can see my buckets right from Visual Studio. So we got a new user, access key, secret access key. This is a permanent user credential. I can call AWS services under this context. So if I just quickly do a demo here, I'm calling a simple S3 based list bucket. So let's go in. This is the client object, and it's working under this current profile. I can change the profile if a user is working on multiple users. And to show you the actual call, I will run Fiddler just to capture that call. Okay, hopefully it's working good. And I'm gonna do this. I'm gonna just make it call again. Okay, I should have gotten the call. Here you go. And as you can see, here is my XML response. By the way, not all services are JSON. The older services were XML, and then it moved into JSON-based responses. And that's the beauty of SDK. Like, you don't need to know what the underlying actual response schema is. So if you see the call, that's the call that was made. And in the call, there is something called authorization, right? So if you see that, so it has access key. I mean, there's nothing secret about access key. The secret key is the one which is secret. So the HMAC signature is generated by that secret key. Okay, using the secret key, the HMAC signature is generated. This is what gets validated on the AWS end. Okay, so let me close the Fiddler. Okay, that was a very simple example of calling an AWS service. I'm gonna do is I'll show you one more example quickly here. Come on, please cooperate. Thank you. Let's go and stop that. Okay, great. So in this case, what I'm gonna do is I'm going to create a new user directly from within using the SDK. I have this policy that's being assigned. This is the username that I'll be creating. If I want to see the list of users currently, I don't see the S3 read-only access user. So let's go ahead and run this. Okay, so that just got created. Let's refresh it. And here is my new credential that got created. And if I see the policy, it does have the policy to do S3 get star or star, right? So you could do the same manipulation via SDK, CLI, PowerShell. This is a simple example of creating a user with policy. Okay. So what did we touch here is basically two things. Created a IAM user, permanent credentials, right? And I have used it successfully to call a AWS service. It actually used a secret key to generate the HMAC signature, and using that HMAC signature, it called the AWS service. In this case, I called S3. I could very well call other services, like let's do another one. Here is a service called to comprehend. So given list of text, it can actually do an analysis of the sentiment inside that particular text, right? So let's quickly go and see this one. Okay, so let's go in and you create the comprehend client. And here I'm calling. So just to make sure we see those calls. Again, it's working under the same credential that currently it is connected with. You may ask, like, what if this code is on EC2? Do I need to configure access key, secret access key? And that's where we will go next. So let's me quickly run this. Okay, so it calls so many different functions and it identified different set of attributes from it. Here you go, if you see. It found sentiment negative. It called and found the key phrases. It found the actual entities, there was not many. And then it found the actual language in the text that was being passed, right? And each one of them, it's basically the same thing. Header-wise, you see the same authorization, right? That's being passed. Okay, so any API call, that is gonna be the way in which it passes the HMAC signature. Okay, so let's go back to our. So users, groups, and roles. On roles, we'll be going much deeper in very quickly. So you have identity, you assign policy, and based on that policy, user will have access to resources. You create policies where you specify effect, allow, deny, and you specify the actual action. There are a lot of granular level settings inside a policy that you could specify. And then the third, which is the key, where you can have a compute environment assume a role. So in this case, if you see, this is AWS again. When you're creating, let's say EC2 service, you will see which actual role that is does it need to assume. A Lambda can assume a role. So what essentially it means is that it will run under that role, and the policies that are assigned to the role is what it will have access to. But you will say there is no credentials, there is no access key, secret access key. So what actually happens at runtime is it makes a call, the assume role call, makes a call to underlying call to STS, secure token service. And using the secure token service, it gets a temp credential, which is valid for it's configurable time, how long it's valid for. In the code, I can show you a quick example of getting a temp credential. Let's quickly see here. This is, again, a simple API to get. So think of STS as a token vending machine, right? From where you can generate temp credentials. Many enterprise customers who have very custom authorizations, what they do is they actually have a broker on-prem. And that broker is nothing but it's making an STS call to get temp credentials and giving it to their developers and other users for a finite amount of time. And they keep the underlying authorization on-prem. That's another model that I have seen some customers implement. Right, so let's quickly go here. And these SDKs that I'm showing is .NET based, but they're applicable anywhere. Like Java has SDK, same set of APIs are available there. So here you go. I call in, and I'm interested in the actual temp credential call. Here you go. Okay. So that's my, this is the credential. And if I see, sorry, it has the underlying value. Let's go in, it will get that value and pass it. Okay, in this case, there is a permissioning. I've changed the permission, but that was called to get a temp credential. That temp credential, let's go back here. Okay. What is a demo that doesn't fail? Let's quickly go one more time.
Yep.
Right. So let's go in. Yeah, I made a call. Good. Got my credentials, returned it. Okay, if I see this, yeah, this is the one. That's the underlying credential, right? And it has a session token also, which specifies how long. It has details of context for the how long it's valid for, right? So anytime assume role, there is a STS call, temp credential, and that temp credential is what will be the EC2 environment or Lambda environment or container environment will be running against. So the same code, if I take and put it on EC2 and assign a role, the application will be running under that role, and the role will make assume role call will make the STS call, get the temp credential, and run it under that context. Last but not the least, understand the underlying permissions, how it flows across different API services. These are the core basics of IAM, right? Understanding IAM users, groups, roles, groups as in not much, users and roles. Understanding policies is very, very important. And then understanding that, hey, a compute environment can assume a role and run under that particular principle.
And Amit, if I could just toss out, because an issue that we actually had at our company,
yes.
in that there's you can, once if you assume a role, you can then assume another role. It's called role chaining. And what we ran into was a system when you're doing role chaining. There's a maximum time for STS of 1 hour, I believe, and so it's just interesting. I mean, it's down in the weeds for this presentation, but we got bit by that.
Okay, yeah. I mean, temp credentials, last I remember, I think from 1 hour to 36 hours. Last I remember, don't quote me on that.
Right.
So it's configurable, but again, limits are sometimes definitely they can throw you off.
Yeah.
And sometimes limits are helpful. Like I'll give you example. One of the customer created for all of their services, account, VPCs, and other services, they created different popcorn sizes limits. So small, medium, large. And one of the attack that happened, luckily they got it in small account where the actual limits were very, very low. So the attacker was not able to do a lot of things because of those limits. So sometimes it's like a double-edged sword. Should we go higher or should we keep it lower, kind of thing, right? Okay, so coming back to the history here, I mean, this gives you a chart of how the actual IAM on AWS has evolved. In 2006 is when we started with the root user. Never use the root user. I know there are use cases where you have to use root users, but primarily you do not want to use permanent credentials, IAM, and root users. You may want to always explore how you can enable the role-based flow, right? In 2013, we introduced SAML Federation. We'll quickly go touch upon that very soon. So essentially, you have your own identity store, corp identity store. Usually, it's Active Directory, and there are some others also. And so the actual identity stays there, but the authentication part is outsourced. There's a mapping between your corp user sets and the role in AWS. And that mapping decides what permissions the user will get on AWS environment, right? Hence, there is no credential on AWS side. It's just for that period of time when the user comes in, uses it, logs out. That's it. He doesn't have a permanent credential. So essentially, what it means is if the user goes out of Active Directory, like from the organization, he's removed or deactivated from the Active Directory, he doesn't have access to AWS. Whereas if you have an IAM user, he will continue to have that access, right? In 2015, we got switched role. Many developers work on multiple projects and they may be in different set of accounts. So ability to switch roles was very important. And 2017, we got the SSO service. Think of it from a scheme point of view, and many times integrating with, let's say, Okta, Azure AD, and many others. Right, so that's the 2019. We have many others coming in the external directory integrations. So first is human access, right? For human access, you have this concept of master account, organization unit. You have identities inside each account. So when you create an IAM user, it is under a particular account, right? So it means you may have IAM inside each account, right? So there is a proliferation of IAM identities. Hence the, what you call, SSO or federation, because it becomes very hard over a period of time. Are there use cases when you have to use IAM users? There are. Like some customers, when they start, they have very relatively small number of users. They don't have a user directory. In that case, that's fair to start with IAM users. Having best practices of rotating the key and others is super, super important. Slowly, you move towards a single sign-on, right? Single sign-on helps you, like multiple accounts, IAM identities inside each accounts. It's hard to manage, right? SSO gives you that management aspect. Be it you have identity store or not, both are available now. SAML federation, essentially at the bottom line, what you call standard, it has been there for last, I don't know, 15 plus years. SAML 1.1, 2.0. Basically, the flow is in your corp or enterprise directory, the user does the authentication. And from there is a SAML assertion that gets generated. An assertion is an XML kind of, and if you read the specification, it specifies how that SAML assertion gets generated. Before the user calls AWS, there has already been a metadata exchange. So essentially, AWS understands the actual SAML assertion that will be passed. And once that SAML assertion comes, AWS understands the SAML assertion and is able to map it to an IAM role. Now you would say how? There are multiple ways. I have seen customers do security groups in Active Directory to an IAM role in AWS. I have seen customers do custom attributes in Active Directory for a user, mapping to an IAM role. So these are multiple ways in which mapping can be done. Security group to IAM role is the most common. So basically you lump the set of users under one security group or set of security group, let's say developer, testers, managers. And those security groups correspond to an IAM role on the AWS side, right? And whatever policies are assigned to the IAM role, that's the policy the user will have, the temp credential will have, right? So that's the, I mean, typically with Active Directory, you see the ADFS being leveraged. For others, again, it's a federation provider, so essentially it generates the SAML assertion. And based on that assertion, many times you would see this custom attributes passing. So now there is a good use case where additional attributes from Active Directory, like which org does he belong to, who does he report to, or there can be additional information about a user that can be put inside the actual assertion. And that assertion values can be used in your IAM policies. Like, hey, the tag for the resource and the actual principal tag that came in, basically the attribute that came in via assertion, are they matching? So in that case, LO, and if not, deny kind of thing. So those are many use cases that have opened up after that, right? So single sign-on with Azure AD is also enabled now for, again, ability to have SCIM, simple authorizations. And many customers come with like identity store is like somebody decides on Okta, somebody decides on Azure AD, somebody decides on Active Directory. On AWS also, we have Active Directory, and there are many different choices. You could have Active Directory on EC2. You can have your own on-prem and have a hybrid connectivity that can flow into your on-prem Active Directory. And we have our managed directory services also. Right? It seamlessly integrates with many different AWS services. Here are some of those, basically the typical Microsoft stack of SQL Server, .NET based applications, workspaces, all that is connected, and you can integrate with the Active Directory. There is also integration with custom federation provider, as long as they adhere to the SAML standards. So what is a guideline that you may ask, like, what is it? So it's typically with, if you have existing user directory, you may do either SSO with the directory integration, or you may do a SAML federation, right? Those are the two typical. Some unique customers, like with nuanced needs, they go for custom federation. If you don't have an existing user directory, in that case, you would end up with permanent IAM users with obviously following the best practices, or if not, AWS SSO with user pools. Did I hear anyone ask any questions here?
No, it's just background.
Oh, okay, sorry. Okay, so now that was human, right? This is typically human-based access. What if non-human, right? Many times there are use cases where you may deploy an application on EC2, Lambda, ECS, and you want to run under some context. And that's where the role, when you're creating, you specify that, hey, EC2 can assume this role. So the application on that EC2 will have access to that particular role. Permissions are something which just takes a time to learn, but I'll just quickly go through the policies. This is administrator, strict no, as right. You want to go to the principle of least privilege as much as possible. So let me go through the permissions here. Yeah, so this is example of calling a DynamoDB. Here is the API call. No, I want permissions, so let's quickly go here. Yeah, here we go. Okay, so this is the policy. Let's see what policy I have specified. I am saying hello with star as action and star as resources, right? It is significantly wild open. So this is definitely not least privilege. So you want to narrow it down, right? You can go to this one, narrowed it down to only all DynamoDB actions, but still all resources. You want to go further. So actions, I only want to do, let's say, get item and put item. Resources, again, all of it. Great on the actions part. Resources still, I think, needs improvement. So now we came to the actions as get item, put item, and then resources, if you see, very narrowed down to a specific resource table, right? So that's the evolution, like how you start and move your IAM policies. For that takes time to learn through the IAM documentation, right? We have significant detailed documentation on IAM, and there is a new service that got recently launched. A feature in that, the Access Analyzer, actually has a way to look at your CloudTrail and actually come back and suggest you the policy that you can use, because it will analyze and it'll come back with the policy that would help that will help you restrict the permissions.
Can I ask you a question? Because we were starting to do that at our company, because we have policies that are used all over the place, and so it's hard for us to know how to restrict them. And I started looking at Access Analyzer, but I thought it was just for S3. Is it for all services now?
Yeah. So let me just open up. There's a new announcement that happened just day before yesterday.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, that's why I also need to see. You never know. There is so many things happening, right? Access Analyzer. Let's see. Actually, I should have picked that up and put in that information. Yeah, I did, but here we go. IAM Access Analyzer, a new thread treat for all your permission setters out there. This is the tweet that I just picked and put. This is from a PM.
Oh,
and now
my
Access
goodness,
Analyzer
yay.
generates policies based on your CloudTrail activity. So I haven't actually myself gone through and looked at, but this is pretty neat. Like being able to actually automate the part of looking at your cloud, because CloudTrail is all the API calls. And it is basically reverse engineering from the API calls to what actions do I need to have access to. So that is super simplification. Have I gone through and looked at in detail? I have not yet.
Oh my God, I was about to be tasked with writing that scraper. Yay! Thank you. That's the price of admission for me right there, man. Thank you.
I know. But for now, there is policy documentation out there that's significant. So that helps once you're working through it, right?
Ryan, I posted in the chat. There's a link to another tool that does that as well. You make API calls from your client, and it writes the IAM code for you.
Oh my goodness. Sweet. Okay. Wow.
That's pretty neat.
Team, this meetup rocks.
Okay, so I'm going through the same policies quickly, because there are many flavors of the policies that you could write, right? You could have resource-based policies for S3 buckets. You can enable cross-account access, right? Here is example of allowing it by the org. So AWS organization, you could filter it by the conditions of org. So basically, instead of going one account as a principal, you give it by the org. So all accounts within an organization get access to. You can have cross-account IAM roles, again, setting up trust. And then one role can assume a role in another account and do the operations. Again, if you go SSO, you don't have to do this, right? What is the best practices? Resource-based policies when applicable. So standard IAM is one, but there are service-specific policies also. So you should look at the services that you're using and if there are additional knobs there. Unless you have a specific reason, trust the entire organization. That's usually the mandate, but you may have your own custom needs here. Trusting, obviously, AWS services, right? You specify that way it can assume the role. When you are evolving your identity guideline, there are key set of principles that you want to follow always. Basically, MFA, audit credentials, those are best practices always to follow. As much as possible, use temp credentials. We know for sure the glue here is assume role, makes a temp call, and gets you a temp credential. You can yourself make a STS call, get a temp credential, and enable some of your operations. As much as temporary credentials are being used, you are definitely in a secure territory. The more you use the permanent user, you may have kind of a security, unless you are having a very diligent review of all the rotations and other things. Right? Store secrets, important. Parameter stores, secrets manager, there are multiple services. I prefer secrets manager for the fact that it can do auto rotation, right? So that's very, very, many of the times serverless applications and secrets managers have a deep integration. So using that would be very helpful. SSO for command line based access. I think 22nd of March, we announced now Visual Studio Code, which is very famous IDE across many developers, has the support for SSO. So you don't have to have, like in this case, right now, here, I have specified AWS users access key and secret access key, right? The work for SSO here is in progress, but Visual Studio Code already got it. So use that as much as possible. So you're going towards more secure territory. Permissioning, principle of least privilege, looking, reviewing. There is good amount of guidance. Conditions, as you can see, you can go very, very detailed in the conditions on that day, by that time, between these locations, all that is available. Right? Defense in depth goes many different territories. And we are talking more towards enterprise organization use cases. When you go through other areas like intrusion preventions, application level security, like cross-site scripting, SQL injection. So you have to have that defense in depth enabling WAF service, right? So each one of them has a play. So KMS, again, encryption, decryption, everybody knows, yes, but what? Server-side key, should I use KMS? Now, if I use KMS and do a S3 bucket encryption, can I just call get object and get it? No, you need permission to actually access the KMS key to decrypt, right? So that there is again IAM flow that comes in. Touched upon the IAM access analyzer. I'm going to go deep into this service, since this is going to simplify a lot of IAM policies. Beat and all, there is a little bit of pain in terms of writing IAM policies, and this will simplify a lot of that. Right? So this is, so far what we have touched is kind of an operator flow and not the end client for an application access. So what do we do for that, right? The other side of it. The other side is basically the answer is Cognito. And Cognito, I say authentication as service, and it enables a lot of different use cases. At the top level, it has user pool and identity pool, right? It gives you all kinds of, for web applications, mobile applications, all kinds of things that get you started in minutes, right? Hosted UI, supports SAML, supports OAuth, has SDK for mobile, has SDK for JavaScript and all the different languages. And if the actual user, the end client user wants to access AWS resources, there is a model for identity pool, where again, as soon as you see identity pool and temp credentials, what is happening here? An assume role call, temp credentials, and that's the temp credential that will access additional AWS resources underlying. Right? Gives you pretty neat UI that you can integrate in your application. and has many different set of integrations with. You can see we actually now have Apple also integrated, right?
Hey, Amit,
Yes.
is there any news about being able to replicate Cognito across availabilities, across regions?
Oh, okay. That's one of the very highly requested product feature request. If you can send me an email at amitjh, I would want to plus one with your use case. amitjh@amazon.com. I would add your also scenario to that PFR.
All right.
Thank you. So Cognito OAuth support, right? I mean, we touched upon SAML on the corporate operator flow. OAuth is on the web mobile client. So essentially, it's similar concept, but in case of SAML, you had SAML assertion. Here there is token. You must be familiar with JOT tokens, right? And they are two in parallel, but this has evolved. Initially, it was from an authorization point of view, and then the OpenID Connect was added for authentication. And it has concept of tokens, flows, scopes, claim, different types of tokens, refresh token, access token, bearer token, right? And each one has different set of functionality. So Cognito supports, and you can integrate both the way, right? You can have user in your user pools, as well as don't have it and have a SAML based integration. It supports both the use cases. This is a typical flow for Cognito. Authenticate. You can go get federation based access, get the token. That token is retrieved. That is then gets passed to the actual services that you're using. Let's say you have an API hosted on API via API gateway. So you pass that cup token to the API gateway. Does that? It will do an authorization using that token, and then validate the user. In cases where you have interaction to identity pool, again the cup token is passed to the identity pool, and then in this case it's the mapping between the cup token with a temp credential based call. In case of SAML, you had security group or user attributes mapped to an IAM role. In this case, the cup token maps to an IAM role and gets you the temp credentials. And once you have the temp credentials, you can access underlying AWS resources, S3, DynamoDB, and other based use cases. Assertion token. Assertion is kind of bulky, XML based. You can have additional attributes there. Tokens are shorter. JOT, I mean, top has the header, and then you can have payload. Security wise, you should not put key PII into the token. Only put something that is a pointer from where you can actually get additional information if you need to get. In many of the web applications, I'll give you example. Let's open. So I put in paper CFPs, right, via session ICE. And if I go to login, you see, I get this classic Twitter, Office, Google, Facebook. All this is basically an OAuth based flow. So it will go say that, hey, go to the provider. So relying party, actually, it'll say, hey, I need to have authorization, a token with scope of maybe I need his name access and permission to do this. That gets passed, and using that, it will log me in. Right, so that's the Cognito flow. We have different SDKs for Cognito. Oh yeah, this one got launched just today. And this is basically Cognito sample for doing, you can say, role-based, where you're passing custom roles, and you can specify which one is allowed for which role. Like in this case, you can see with the function, I have specified a header. Hey, only admin roles can do that. So, and check that, hey, whether the current user has the claim with admin. So you can have those kind of use cases, role-based access security, right? This is another example for attribute. I discussed the SAML assertion and custom attribute being passed. Now, once that attribute is passed, as you can see, you got in. Now you have a way in which resource tags and the attribute that came in via the SAML assertion, if they map. So department, so department as in the tag and department as in the actual attribute that came in, if they both match, hello, right? That's the policy simplification that you could do. SAML attributes, you had to do many policies, conditions, and now you can actually use it as a variable and match. Tagging based on authorization helps in many different use cases. Many people are leveraging this for attribute-based access and permissioning. This is another area, fine-grained permissioning in data lake. So lake formation is our service, which has the model of mastering the permissions. And whenever the data moves from lake formation to other services, the permissions also flows along with it. So the user does not have to do the permissions multiple times. Here is a detailed, and I'll share this deck completely of an implementation of the same. Are we just by AWS IAM, or do we have a lot of, we have significant amount of partners. I have put in some of the names that I keep seeing in many different customer accounts and other places. Auth0, now Auth0 and Okta are one. So basically there is a marriage between Auth0 and Okta. I thought it's a pretty good admin and a developer. I felt that way. But I do see ping identity, one login, and each one has, many times you think of, I was thinking Okta as primarily from a federation or SSO point of view. Now Okta is actually evolving as a identity master, like its own identity master, right? So there is a good amount of, maybe we need to come up with some kind of universal identity everywhere. So that's the list of partners, but this is not exhaustive. We have many other partners that we work very closely from a security and identity point of view. Okay, so that was quick run through. I do have quick samples on the identity. If you see here, let's see. So Cognito, yeah, here you go. Same thing, like I use the SDK. We have a Cognito identity provider. And again, the same set of flows. In this case, I'm calling an API and putting in the actual access token as an authorization header for the API. And that access token goes and validates, right? So this is one way of implementing. There are many other ways. You can have a JavaScript and call an API, pass in the, there are best practices there, I should say. And I think we'll touch upon the application security area very quickly. And now I'll quickly go through the other 4 areas on the security side, and then we can probably take the questions at the end. So from us data, bottom line, don't give access to data to people, right? I mean, that's the bottom line, but the goal is to have least amount of access for least amount of period to least amount of people. Probably that's what we want. And if you actually have the need to store, try not to store it for some time. If you store, encrypt, mask, tokenize. So tokenize for, let's say, if you have SSN and some kind of ID-based thing, tokenization works pretty well for them. Encryption, decryption using server-side key or KMS or your own, SafeNet, Luna, or others. Isolate as much as possible. Human access is what I see many times that becomes an issue. If you have automation for the whole DevSecOps and CFN or Terraform or CDK or others, that helps actually limit data exposure. Right here, key, identify your data. I mean, some finserts, I have seen the exercise of actually classification for data, like this is HPI, PII, MBI. And based on that, they map it to the encryption level, cipher width, and all that kind of thing. And then they evolve like what encryption, which key management system, is it hardware, is it, so that's the strategy that you have to have, and then have the encryption REST transit implemented. This is example of how we are enabling direct encryption in the actual services. So it's just a checkbox. This is S3, this is EBS. So if you enable this KMS integration with S3, again, the IAM permission, if you see the need for calling the underlying KMS decrypt operation will become important when you do a simple S3 get object. When you deploy an application, you deploy it on a particular VPC. So network, policy, defense in depth, again, that applies here. We give you security groups, NACLs that do that first level. Again, here you can actually specify, hey, only within this particular organization. IAM plays a significant role in many different places. This is application level. I mean, everybody probably is familiar with web applications and securities issues that can happen, like injection, broken authentication. I mean, if you take the end client use case, I talked about tokens. If you get it on the client side, can that token be accessed? Should you see if the token is only on the server side, right? SQL injection lives on. So, I mean, WAF does the good job of restricting, but still we see some customers getting issues with that. CI/CD, very, very important. Security is not an afterthought. It should be done before. When we do CI/CD, do we actually think of vulnerable libraries, code, credentials? Many times we have heard, right? This was a credential in GitHub, access keys in GitHub. So having the right level of secure development practices with set of tools, right? Yeah, obviously, you know, the fire that's going on. Each one you can have. And again, here also you will see the same pattern. Like IAM coming in, you have the even third parties like Vera Code I have seen, where security analysis is done as part of CI/CD. SonarQube, analysis of the code. DevSecOps pipeline helps you reduce security events later. So like 10 years back, I saw this metric of if you have a bug that you fix in SDLC versus fix in once it has been identified via production, it's like the cost is 75% more, something around that. How do you do that, right? To be secure, you got to have proactive governance, and that's where the log metrics traces. And I see many customers here, like enabled, capturing, stored, but then it's all noise. Like the next level is correlation and insights, and the nirvana is automatic identification and self-healing kind of thing, right? We give you several set of tools, logs, matrix, and X-ray. X-ray is a pretty neat service from a correlation point of view, and it correlates, gives you a path to troubleshoot those pesky performance-based use cases, right? You have many other partners like Splunk, Datadog, which is going next level and integrating things. So having that observability maturity will help identify security events much faster. Simple example like CloudWatch synthesis. It's a simple service, gives you configurable scripts to do a ping, right? To know actually health of a system. Very neat to use and get notified. If you have issue, obviously sometimes issue happens and things fail. There are events. You have to have a run book. This is an example of what people start with, like some kind of documentation. What happens? What is the data to be looked at? What is the steps to investigate? And then slowly you look to either automate this, right? You may be looking to prevent it or automating the actual solution. The idea is completely evolving from a steps-based runbook to a program that can run and do that operations for you, right? That's important. The other level of integration for security events I have seen is integrating with the AWS Support SDK, personal health dashboard, and integrating the organization's ticketing system like ServiceNow, Remedy, and it automates. So you get an issue, application finds, creates a support ticket automatically using SDK. Notification, again, has a Lambda-based integration, creates a ServiceNow ticket, notifies everyone. Again, there's no manual intervention. Usually, in my experience, many times, it's the manual lag that actually delays the security issue resolution whenever the issues happen. So the more you automate that whole flow, the faster you'll be able to heal from those security events. Okay, so is that in 40 minutes everything? What's the next? Here is something I'm gonna share, which is basically what all practices I told you. We have workshops for each area, right? So that goes into the next level of implementation, like let's say data security we touched upon. So this will go into show how you create the work with KMS, encryption, decryption, VPC endpoint. I mean, we haven't touched upon like some of the services. Let's say from a private subnet, you have to access AWS services. Okay, S3 access points. I mean, there are many other things that comes in from that point of view. So each one area we have workshop, and it's basically on your own time. You can go through the workshop. We have a pretty detailed came across this ramp up guide, which goes from a basics to advanced level, right? And finally, I would encourage people to aim for the security certification. That gets your security credentials. Okay, so now I will shut off and open up for a question. Sorry, I actually passed more than 45 minutes.
That was amazing. So
I mean, be frank. I mean, I this is a topic that I have been evolving. This is probably second iteration of it, and I need to improve this because sometimes you get the operations audience. Sometimes you get developer. I'm trying to keep it more devy and evolving this more. So I need feedback if there are things that should be changed.
Okay.